Integrating quotations in the body of your essay is actually surprisingly difficult. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some common mistakes that I often see, and these are mistakes that you'll want to avoid yourself. So I am going to assume as we go through this that you know some of the basics of quoting, and especially the idea that there are really three parts to a properly integrated quote. And these are the signal phrase, which is your words introducing the quote itself, and then lastly, some kind of citation, and that is often a page number. So assuming that we know some of these basics of quoting, let's go on to our first example here. Now, as we look at this, I have used straight quotation marks here because that's all the program allows me to do. But if you are writing in Microsoft Word, as you should do, then you should use curved quotation marks. And actually, when I see these straight quotes, it's often a sign that people are plagiarizing and that they've copied something from the web. If we look at these examples here, each of these examples is quoting a fairly short phrase from a novel by Charles Dickens. And the thing to remember is that if you're quoting a phrase as opposed to a complete sentence, it's often best to run your signal phrase directly into the quote without any intervening punctuation. Okay, so try to follow this example, this last one, as opposed to these first two, which are technically incorrect. And you'll see that the first one is what we call formal introduction, which ends with a colon, and the second one is a short signal phrase, which has a subject and a verb of expression, such as writes, argues, suggests, and so forth. So just to repeat, try to use a run-in signal phrase with a shorter quotation that's not a complete sentence. The second example here shows another thing that's quite common, and this is where students try to cram as much information into their quotation, or their signal phrase rather, as possible. So we have here on page 18, we refer to an article, we give the title, and then we have the name. Typically, all you need to do in the run-up to the quotation is just provide the name. That's really all you need to do. The only time that you really need to mention the title is if you are, for instance, quoting from somebody multiple times and this person has written a number of works and you have to distinguish them, or if the title is significant for some reason, or you're going to spend quite a bit of time on this particular piece. But typically, you don't need to give the title, and you also don't need to give the page number or state where this is from. The author is all you need, and then the citation can go after the quotation, which would be page 18 in this case, and then we get rid of the final punctuation mark, and we replace it with a period after the citation. The third thing here is also very common, and this is where students introduce the quote by using the word quote, and then often afterwards they use the same word as well. Now, this is awkward for a number of reasons, in part because it suggests that in the original text this was already a quotation, which it doesn't have to be. So a better word for this would be something like passage, or if you're talking about poetry or something like that, lines would be good as well. Okay? Or you can just totally rephrase and say something about the quote that gives us a sense of what is going on. The only time I would use quote is in the phrase to quote, and then give the critic's name or the author's name, to quote X, and then give the quotation. But even that is fairly casual and is probably less common in academic writing. All right, number 4 here. Number 4 has to do with flattery. So you really don't have to flatter the person you're quoting. And that includes scholars, such as in the first example here, or authors if you're writing a literary essay. You don't have to say that somebody is notable or a scholar or is writing memorably. Okay, so these things you can really do without. Number 5. This is another common one in literature essays, and this is where we have confused the author with the character. In this case, it's not Dickens, Charles Dickens, who is saying this in the text, but it's a character called Wemmick. So we should say Wemmick says, and then we have the quotation. So watch out for that. I think this one's fairly easy to avoid. Just don't confuse the author with the character. Number 6, and we're almost done, so hang in there. Number 6 is where we introduce the quote and then we keep going after the quote, and that's fine for fairly short quotations, but it's quite awkward for longer ones such as we have here. And the other thing I often see is that people use these present participles to introduce or keep going after a quote. Another common one is showing. So people will quote and then they'll say, showing that, blah, 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 blah. Avoid that. I find it very awkward. And it's usually best after a longer quotation just to put a period and start a new sentence. Number 7, this is more just some general advice. Be careful where you place your quotations. So if you think about a paragraph and you start your paragraph with a topic sentence and you conclude it with some kind of observation, it's typically best not to stick quotations at the beginning or end of a paragraph. Because what happens is that your voice is hidden a little bit and the critic's voice or the author's voice sort of gets in the way. So if you want to give structure to an essay or paragraph, it's often best to make sure that your voice is heard at the beginning and the end of a paragraph. Although it's not technically wrong to put a quote there, you should be cautious in terms of doing that. And then we get to 8 and 9 here, and this has to do with block quotations. So a block quotation is a fairly long quotation, 4 or more lines if you're using the MLA guidelines. And my suggestion would be that if you're introducing it, try to use something a bit more extensive than just something like he writes. In this example, you can see that the sentence after the quote really explains what the quote is about. And what you're doing by putting this afterwards is you're making the reader wait a long time before you sort of explain what the point of the quote is. So my suggestion would be make sure that you put as much information before the quote as you can so that you can really help the reader understand what's coming up. And that just makes reading a lot easier. And then the other point is that another thing I often see is that after a block quotation, for some reason people indent what comes afterwards. But you really shouldn't start a new paragraph right after a long block quote. You need to say something about the block quotation, point out why it's significant, tie it to your other points, and then start a new paragraph. Okay, so there's a lot more we could say about integrating quotations. We could talk about, making sure you give enough context to a quote. There's a lot of other things we can say, but I hope at least this video shows you some of the most common mistakes to avoid.